To all of history's losers. That's the dedication on the first page of Jack Halberstam's book, The Queer Art of Failure. It's a very unique work, and I think we will have fun discussing it today and going through all of the very diverse topics of the book, ranging from supposedly monogamous penguins over societal pressure on marginalized groups to a 10-page discussion of the B-movie. The book talks about feminism, queer theory, life in capitalism and neoliberalism, and many other topics, and I will try to guide you through the themes of the work and tie them all back together under the umbrella goal of taking an alternative look at failure. But of course, Halberstam will also not leave without being critically examined in this video, which I will do at the end. I'm glad to be back and to be discussing this interesting work, and I also love how it reconnects us to the end of the last video where we took a brief look at Byung-Chul Han's daily routine. And I ended by saying that I think we should all strive to be more of a failure in whatever sense that we feel it could enrich our lives. So let's get started with that, but not without stumbling a few times on the way. The book, The Queer Art of Failure, was published in 2011, but under a different name, since Halberstam has since been publishing under the name Jack. I'm being very precise here and not saying that Halberstam came out as trans or something, because he himself is very liberal with this, and he said in an interview to the question of his preferred pronouns, quote, people are kind of calling me he nowadays, so I'm going with that. It's been such an issue, this name business, unquote. So as Halberstam said in this video, I'm just going to go with he, him too, but I did want to mention this briefly. A bit more on him as an intellectual. Halberstam is a researcher and an author of various influential books in the area of queer theory, feminism, subculture, and visual culture, all of which are very much present in this book, but none of these limit the audience that the book can be interesting to in any way. It's not a book specifically for queer people or for sinophiles. It's more of an attempt to break boundaries, reconsider knowledge, render it common sense, and engage critically in modern society, politics, art, and history. If that sounds all over the place, it's because it is. But I feel like that's what also makes the book very engaging to read. It doesn't feel like one of these theory texts that say the same thing in different variations over 250 pages. Instead, every chapter is like a new world with some new movie references, new ideas, and new ways of living presented to us. Here, I'm gonna summarize the ones that I find most suitable for this format and always end with a connection to our personal lives, something that we can take away from the content. Theoretical background. In each of the chapters, Halberstam makes use of low theory. Low theory is a term coined by Stuart Hall in a comment on a work by Gramsci, so this is really science at its best already. I love it. Low theory, as Halberstam sees and defines it, has the goal of rejecting the binary between high and low culture, which is heavily shaped by colonial and classicist power structures. For a bit of context on this, you can watch my video about Pierre Bourdieu and culture capital, where I explain how cultural markers and distinctions are used to uphold social hierarchies, and, for example, render culture products of marginalized groups lower than the art canon produced by colonizers and/or the upper class. So, in a very blunt and straightforward way, Halberstam is going to talk about SpongeBob, Pixar animations, and trashy movies in this book. This doesn't just stop at art or movies. It is rather an epistemological approach to science that pushes through, quote, the divisions between life and art, practice and theory, thinking and doing, unquote, and moves into a more chaotic realm of knowing and unknowing. In order to really understand this, I want to make a very quick detour and talk about social epistemology, because I think it's kind of a basis for this work without it really being mentioned explicitly. If you know what social epistemology is, you can skip to the next part, you impatient TikToker. First of all, epistemology is the science, or rather the philosophy of knowledge. What is knowledge? What and how can we know? What is truth? Does it exist? Can we ever find it? And if we do, would we even notice? All of these questions. Traditionally, in Western philosophy, these questions were attempted to be answered with logic. Whole systems of logic were built, and knowledge was for a very long time defined as GTB, a justified true belief. You have to have a justified reason for believing something, and the belief has to be true when compared to reality. Fast forward to 1963, Edmund Gettier randomly drops a 3-page paper that destroys the approach to knowledge that was basically the consensus since Plato. I'm not going to go into all the details, but basically there was a shift in epistemology, and one of the solutions some researchers took was going into the new direction of social epistemology, which kind of accepts that we might not be on the right path with human-made logic, and it is more important to observe the way that knowledge operates in our world. Instead of asking what is knowledge, they might ask who has the power to define what is seen as knowledge or what is seen as true in a given society. Who is believed more easily because of their ethnicity or their gender? In which situations is knowledge demanded socially? How do different cultures handle knowing and not knowing? So as you can see, the approach is way more relative and allows for a variety of answers, depending on the speaker's position, their culture, their experience with oppression, etc. That's why Halberstam is particularly interested in different knowledges. If you haven't heard about social epistemology or discourse analysis, you might have found this term weird, like knowledge in plural, knowledges. We use this term precisely because Halberstam acknowledges the cultural differences and power structures that shape what a society regards as the truth and how they try to achieve knowledge. So he doesn't just want to stick with a traditional scientific approach, but instead tries to find the, quote, in-between spaces that save us from the hooks of hegemony, unquote, and hopes to find alternative forms of knowledge there. Very aware of the fact that a scientific work talking about the bee movie for 10 pages might not be taken seriously, he states that it is actually his intention not to let his work be limited by the pressure to appeal to what is considered serious science and what isn't. And honestly, I really like this as a personal attitude. He seems like he doesn't feel the need to prove himself, and I think that's a very valuable trait as a social science researcher. So, let's dive into a few of these worlds and have a look at what we can take away from the book. I selected the topics that I think are most engaging to talk about on this channel and in this format, hopefully capturing the spirit and essence of the work, but it is not my intention to give an exact retelling of everything said in it. I especially don't really go into details on all of the movie references that he makes. My intention is rather to apply the way of thinking that this book promotes to other areas, and I mean both areas of research and of life. That's why I want to end each section with something that you can sort of take away personally, like for example the thing I said just now about Halberstam being inspiring, because he doesn't limit himself by what society already sees as serious scientific work, but rather broadens that scope. Wanting to be taken seriously under a rigid scheme of what is considered serious work can end up heavily limiting your research outcome, or your art, or your writing, or anything else you do. So, let's finally start talking about failure, starting with the first thing you can and maybe should fail at. Perhaps the most overarching theme of the book is Halberstam's goal to find a third way between cynical resignation on the one hand and naive optimism on the other. So let's first have a look at why he's so skeptical towards optimism. Failing at optimism. Have you ever heard of the book The Secret? If you have, I'm sorry, and if you haven't, I'm even more sorry that you will now be confronted with something truly horrifying. The Secret is a sort of self-help book that claims that through manifestation and positive thinking, the universe aligns itself to our wishes. Yeah, okay, but this goes further than what you're thinking right now. This book literally claims that you can cure chronic diseases that way and become a millionaire with a house on a tropical island that you own. What's so problematic about that is that if, for instance, you don't cure your disease by really wishing for it, you are the one that's at fault because you just didn't believe enough or manifest enough. Halberstam doesn't explicitly mention this book, but what he says criticizes the exact movement that this book both belongs to and started, or at least multiplied. Talking specifically about the US, he describes how positive thinking has been used as a way to delegate responsibility for everything to individuals, disregarding lack of healthcare, systems of oppression, classism, and many other structures that make it clearly easier for some to achieve their dreams than for others which do not even have the time or the resources to dream, that are fighting for their survival every day. If this reminds you of my video on neoliberalism, it's because it is the same exact idea. Inequality is upheld by making everyone think that they have the same opportunities and are totally free to pursue their dream life. Thereby, the oppressive structures can conveniently escape the discussion. So Halberstam does not want to promote a naive optimism for queer people and other marginalized groups that will end up just making them feel responsible for their own suffering because they just didn't manifest freedom hard enough. On the other hand, he also doesn't want them to just give up. His goal is to find these in-between spaces, whether they're small utopias, animated movies, political movements, or whatever actually makes life livable. And one possible way to get there, according to him, can be found in failure at what society lays out for you. His point is that once you leave the normative path of success that oppresses you, and just accept being seen as a failure, there might be a whole new world of options for you that can enrich your life. Yeah, I will come back to this part later in my critique on his work, don't worry. For now, what can we take away from this? I think this heavily depends on each person individually. But if you fall under the category of, I'm not allowed to be sad because others have it so much worse, why have I not become a famous entrepreneur yet and others have, and it's my fault that I have a mental or physical illness or something, you have definitely in some way been affected by this sort of toxic positivity or pressure-laden optimism. I also made a small video on this topic if you're interested in that, in which I reflect on how society has built the idea that out of hardship necessarily follows inspiration or something beautiful, an idea very shaped by survivorship bias and putting a lot of pressure on people going through crises. If that's the case for you, it might be beneficial to take a look at who profits from you thinking that way, and whether it wouldn't be better to accept life as the complex thing that it is without attempting to push away the bad stuff in order to be seen as a good, optimistic citizen by society. You might consider failing at optimism. Failing at family and capitalism. Halberstam criticizes the societal focus on hetero marriage, as have many others, but I do think some nuances are special here. For example, in one of the detours that he makes, he talks about a penguin documentary, and what he criticizes is something very crucial in my opinion. It's a pretty profound science criticism, even though it doesn't seem like it at first. Basically, Halberstam describes how the documentary March of the Penguins became super popular, but one of the reasons for that is that it projects a heteronormative Christian family idea onto penguins. The documentary turns their life and their species into a story about monogamous spouses caring for their offspring, when in reality penguins are only monogamous for 1 year and then quite literally abandon their offspring and leave the kids to themselves. Why is this so important? Because it shows how deeply our society's values impact even our observations of nature. We think in patterns, and if we see 2 penguins caring for their child, we see a happy marriage after the Christian ideal. Well, not necessarily, but you get what I mean. We subconsciously project our own human cultural traditions onto animals, which are then in turn used by queerphobic argumentations to say that something goes against nature. In a way, it is a very similar structure to the colonial projection of patriarchy onto other cultures, which I discuss in my video on Oyewumi, the invention of women. And why are we so focused on the monogamous heteromarriage as a society? Well, because it is the ultimate connection between capitalism and the private life, between production and reproduction. Capitalism has always been connected to the patriarchy, because if you have a wife at home doing all the domestic labor, you can pay the working husband less since he doesn't have to have spare money for a cook or a nanny. Also, women can birth children, hopefully strong, healthy men, that can then be labor forces and uphold the cycle of capital accumulation. If women have the weird idea that they also want to partake in public life now, we can let them, but they still need to do the domestic labor on top of their potential full-time job now. So basically, a hetero couple is a perfect manifestation of capitalism in the home. That doesn't mean that all hetero marriages are evil capitalists, of course not. I just wanted to point out why capitalism profits from a societal pressure on men and especially on women to get married and have lots of kids, and why capitalism and patriarchy are historically connected. And all of this is of course way more nuanced and not a conscious process that some evil guy decided to promote one day. It's a system that grew historically, is what I'm trying to say. So, for Halberstam, failing at heteromarriage and failing at capitalism go hand in hand, and both hide some wonderful potential according to him. If a queer marriage, or any marriage without kids, so without reproduction of labor force, automatically fall out of the capitalist ideal, it might open up a way to escape from other logics of power as well. While you could be seen as a failure by some because of that, you could also be the one having free time for your hobbies, for example, or being able to travel. Some arrangements even spare you the pressure of expectation from others because they simply do not know what to expect and therefore cannot confront you in that manner. Halberstam also has a whole part about forgetting and the power of sort of actively forgetting to carry on the oppressive power structures to the next generation by not having children or by not teaching them the same oppressive values. But to be honest, the only section where I will discuss this part is in the end when I criticize it. What can we take away here? Penguins are not Christians is definitely the biggest shocker of this section. Other than that, I think it can offer a way to reconsider the normative path laid out for us that we sometimes do not reflect on or question, but that might not really be the best for everyone. That doesn't mean it cannot be what you want or what makes you happy. It just means that we have to be able to let people be happy on their own terms, even if those don't make sense to us and aren't what we want in life. Granted that no one is harmed, of course. Our generation has the great privilege of having access to all of these discourses and being able to reflect on what you want instead of just following the normative path. That can be overwhelming and is still a privilege, I know. But in this case, I think it's a great opportunity to avoid a good luck babe situation. Failing at history, historical failures. If you feel like this next chapter is a thematic leap, then you're absolutely right. After trying really hard to find a smooth transition, I just accepted my failure and I'm now gonna just drop the next aspect. A critique of historical accounts about oppressed groups, with the example of the participation of gay men in Nazi Germany. Yeah, I mean, that would logically just be the next thing that you talk about after penguins. What Halberstam criticizes is a linear approach to history that ignores the complexity of systems of oppression, with the example of groups of people that have historically been considered failures, and their individual ways of coping with that. In this case, I don't want to specifically talk about the example laid out in the book, but rather focus on the bigger critique that Halberstam makes. I think there are two very crucial points here. The first is still connected rather closely to the case study of marginalized subjects participating in systems that oppress them. Halberstam describes how historical accounts tend to lay out that these oppressed groups are having a fixed identity stretching across time, like a queer identity, for example, that doesn't change in its core but is just surrounded by varying degrees of oppression. The mistake is to shy away from capturing the complexity of these identities and how their relation to the government shifted and shifts, how they are sometimes oppressed for reasons that can easily be overthrown, even though they are presented as moral reasons. The best example would again be Alice Weidel, the leader of the far-right party in Germany, that wants to take queer rights away and that encourages a traditional family model, with Alice Weidel herself being in a long-term partnership with a woman. In many cases, what is actually being upheld is capitalism or neoliberalism, and not something religious or moral. Like I said before, it is very often about the continuation of capitalist logic within the family home. And if you're in a sapphic relationship with both of you enthusiastically supporting far-right viewpoints, the party couldn't care less about you being with a woman. The next, more abstract critique that I see Halberstam making is one about our debate culture. I think what he's really concerned about in this whole discussion is how researchers, historians, and also people in their everyday discussions oversimplify certain topics because it would be too complex to bear that the group of people that they're trying to describe as the victims are more than just that. They are victims of oppression, but they might also oppress other groups or even uphold their own oppression, whether consciously or out of fear for their life. This is not about saying, oh my god, look at these people, it was their fault all along. And having to specify this is precisely the problem, because we're so intent on making it very clear that we do not belong to the bad people who discriminate others, we sometimes oversimplify topics out of the fear of our arguments being used by the other side, or being called names by quote-unquote our side. Like, what if the whole book had been about how gay men participated in the Nazi regime? I would have never uploaded it because A, I wouldn't want homophobic people to use that argument for some weird take for their side, but more importantly B, I wouldn't want to have 20 comments just saying that I or Halberstam are ignoring the oppression that they experienced and or victim blaming them. Bold of me to assume that I get 20 comments. It's very complex because that can definitely be true. It would be victim blaming to say that just because someone doesn't actively resist a regime because they would then have to fear their life, they're upholding their own oppression. But what about someone like Alice Weidel, for example? I do see Halberstam's point about this oversimplification limiting our research and our understanding of reality. Again, I think this connects to the focus Halberstam has. Like before, when he said that he's aware of maybe not being taken seriously, but maybe he doesn't care about being taken seriously by people with a narrow mindset. The same applies here. I think his focus is the actual research, the actual understanding of the complexity of a group of people that cannot be defined by just one thing that supposedly makes up their whole identity. And if people are going to misunderstand that because of a simplified understanding that they have, then maybe he doesn't care about that. Not as a person, of course, but as a researcher. And I think that, again, this is a pretty good thing to take away. But I do, of course, also want to remark some criticism, and we'll do that now, before ending with a beautiful quote by Halberstam in the book. There are mainly 3 things I want to point out here, and I think they're all pretty important. The first is concerning his chapter on forgetting, which I didn't cover here content-wise, because I think the criticism is more important to mention. Basically, Halberstam argues for a kind of active forgetting. Now, I do not want to misrepresent this point and literally do the same thing that I just talked about in the previous section, like accusing him of something just because I'm unable to grasp the complexity of the situation. But in a way, I feel like Halberstam points out really good counter-arguments against his own concept and then ends up not refuting them. Like, for example, he talks about his interpretation of works by Toni Morrison and Zadie Smith, and how he sees forgetting as a way of anti-colonial resistance, without really specifying how that can look. He then proceeds to say that he is aware that forgetting and memory erasure has been used as a tool by oppressors to push away their colonial past, for example, and try to make it seem as if nothing happened, or as if there's now equality. And I was like, yeah, exactly, and waiting for a rebuttal of this argument to continue his point, but I didn't really get one. Instead, it was just a very vague formulation, like, yeah, forgetting can help you see new futures. And I think that is the second aspect to be aware of. The book is way more clear in what it rejects than in what it aspires or sees as an alternative. The whole idea of failure being an opportunity doesn't really lead to anything if you don't have your own vision already. And that makes sense. It's possible Halberstam wants to make us reflect on our own, but I think as a political text, this takes away the power of the work, because as a movement it would only be defined by rejection of something and not held together by an ideal. Lastly, and most importantly, I think Halberstam doesn't point out enough that failure is a privilege. I don't want to say he underestimates it, because I cannot imagine him not having any class awareness, but judging strictly by the content of the book, it doesn't really seem like it. He presents these alternative ways of living that arise out of a failing at capitalism or failing at a traditional family, without pointing out that that can literally cost people their lives, whether it's because of poverty, laws, or societal oppression and hate crimes. I think it is a very privileged point of view to talk about the great things that can happen in your life if you fail at university and end up having to take a different path, for example. But what if there isn't one, for the exact reason of inequality that he even mentions in the book? In a way, this approach to failure is the same kind of toxic optimism that Halberstam criticizes, and I think it's important to be aware of that. And therefore, the quote I want to end with has to be taken with this grain of salt, or rather this awareness of the underlying privilege. So I wanted to make sure to point that out before reading the quote, which I nevertheless find beautiful. Quote, "To live is to fail, to bungle, to disappoint, and ultimately to die. Rather than searching for ways around death and disappointment, the queer art of failure involves the acceptance of the finite, the embrace of the absurd, the silly, and the hopelessly goofy. Rather than resisting endings and limits, let us instead revel in and cleave to all of our own inevitable, fantastic failures." Unquote.